Power of the Dog is a brand new film that just hit Netflix that's written and directed by Jane Campion. So The Power of the Dog is a film that I've anticipated for quite some time now, just because both Perry and Jeremy had nothing but fantastic things to say about it, and it's been getting a hell of a lot of great reviews. I've personally never seen a Jane Campion film. The only film I've really heard of from her is The Piano, and that's also another film that I've heard nothing but great things about. I mean, it won 3 Oscars, so it's a film that's kind of had my eye for a while. But after watching The Power of the Dog, I can indeed confirm that this is a great, great film. On pretty much every aspect of filmmaking, this film is quite excellent. The aesthetic value to this film is fantastic. There are so many shots in this film that as they were being presented to me on screen, I was like, wow, that is wonderfully framed and beautifully lit. And not only does it just look gorgeous, but they also establish and express a sense of setting and emotion. And the musical score is such a standout in this film. And it's really interesting because when I was watching this film, about halfway through, I thought that the score reminded me a lot of a cross between There Will Be Blood and Arrival. And I know that's kind of a weird mesh, but that's just what I interpreted from not only the way it sounds, but from the kind of emotion and atmosphere it was going for. And then after watching the film, I looked up who composed the score on IMDb, and sure enough, it's Jonny Greenwood, arguably the best composer working today, and he also did the score for There Will Be Blood, so that kind of explains a lot. And the reason why it does sound and remind me a lot of There Will Be Blood is because through a lot of this film, especially the second half of this film, a lot of the score has this uneasy tone to it. Because even though the story and the character conflicts build its own sense of tension, there is this score that not only accompanies those scenes, but even during scenes that aren't exactly intense, it just expresses this constant note of unease. Not only does it sound unconventional and interesting, but also the way that the score is incorporated into the film is also quite stylistic. And I like that because even as I mentioned, in moments where there isn't anything overtly ominous or overtly confrontational happening on screen, the score does warn you and give you a better picture of what's actually happening beneath the surface. And I think that's a really delicate touch to this film. But the screenwriting to this film is also incredible for a lot of different reasons, whether it's how the film is able to go about expressing its themes about repressed sexuality and being ashamed of your identity, and also the kind of psychological consequences that can yield from a culture and a society that has these unfair and harsh expectations of gender roles. But I love how multidimensional this film is, and not only its themes, but also with the characters. There's hardly any character in this film that comes off one-dimensional and as if they're a cardboard cutout. You kind of are worried about that in the beginning, at least I was, that some of these characters were going to come off a bit one note and not have that much complexity to them. But as the film progresses, their characters become much more complex, and a lot of who they are starts being fleshed out. And the dynamic that builds from all these characters are so interesting. And that's why it's actually really difficult to pick a favorite character in this film, because they all have their own purpose and they all have such interesting layers to them. But I think my favorite character dynamic comes from the characters Peter and Phil. Peter, who's played by Cody Smith-McPhee, and Phil, who's played by the great Benedict Cumberbatch. And it's for a lot of different reasons that I find their dynamic so interesting. But one of the reasons is the fact that they're both very similar people on the inside, but how they both go about expressing themselves in society is completely different. And the action that Peter does in this film, that essentially concludes this film, is so integral to what this film is going for, and I feel like embodies a lot of the thematic relevance of this film. And again, at first I was a bit worried that not only their dynamic, but what he was choosing to do was going to be a bit one-dimensional. But again, as the film progresses, things become more layered and makes it a lot more difficult and a lot more emotionally complex. But I think my favorite scene in this film, and is probably one of those beautiful scenes in the entire film, is a scene where Kristen Dunst's character receives a gift from a Native American and his son. And I just thought it was captured gorgeously. It's such an important moment for Kristen Dunst's character. She plays a character named Rose, but it's also a pivotal moment for the dynamic of Phil and Peter. Jesse Plemons is also in this film, and he plays the husband of Kristen Dunst's character, Rose. And I would say he's probably the most one-dimensional character, even though I wouldn't even characterize him as one-dimensional. But compared to the rest of this film's central characters, I don't think he's as interesting. And I don't know what it is with Jesse Plemons, but I feel like he's in every damn movie that's coming out in recent times. One thing I will say about this film is that it is divided up in chapters, and for me, it didn't really have any significance. It didn't really add anything to the film, and it didn't seem like, this film doesn't really seem like that kind of film that needed to be presented in these different segments. It seems like perfectly fine as one whole piece. Also, when this film divides itself, there's no title to each chapter either. It just says 2, 3, or 4. And maybe if it did have some sort of title to the chapter to express, the meaning behind dividing it up in that way, then perhaps I could have gotten more behind it. And also, even though I do really love the score in this film, there are a very few moments in this film where I feel like the way it kind of comes in and out of certain scenes, could have been done differently. But there really isn't much wrong with this film at all. This is an incredibly subtle and powerful piece of filmmaking that I hope really gets the recognition it deserves come award season. So I'm going to give The Power of the Dog a strong 8 out of 10. Like I said, this film just hit Netflix, so it's pretty accessible, and I recommend everybody to go check this film out because I really don't think you're going to be disappointed by it. But anyways, that's all I got to say about The Power of the Dog. If you really enjoyed what I had to say about the film, please give it a thumbs up and share it amongst your friends. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to be updated on more film-related content.